Yeah, but then it says in verse 5, and they bribed the counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. So now they're beginning to bribe people with money and goods and resources on the inside to try and cause God's people to stop building. So seeking to infiltrate in this way now. Not only is it discouraging, not only is there fear, but there's actual manipulation. There are in fact some of God's people who are selling out. The enemy is at work here. And yet, in spite of it all, God is still in control. Another obstacle we see is fear and intimidation. Ultimately, bribery and manipulation. So we see there's a tendency to compromise can be an obstacle, but also fear and intimidation can be an obstacle to us progressing and growing in the way that God wants us to grow, to fulfill His will for us in our lives. Then there's also something else. There's inflammatory accusations. And the thing is, whether it's true or not, when you seek to assassinate someone's character, it's wrong. It's wrong. Now, what takes place here? This is, I'm going to do the best I can to try to explain this and get it straight in my own head, and hopefully communicate it clearly to everybody here. The next verses, from verse 6 to verse 23, actually don't take place chronologically after the verses you just read. What Ezra did when he wrote this was, you know how I have like stories and pictures and movies and illustrations and so forth to clarify and illustrate the point that I make? You know, and that's exactly what Ezra is doing here. He takes this period of time in verses 6 through 23, and he says, these people were persecuting us. These people were tearing us down and trying to stop what God is doing. And not only were they doing it then, but they keep doing it on into the future, years on down the road. So he takes this historical account of further proof that God's people are being persecuted, and he plugs it in right there to support, reinforce what he's already said. And that's why the parenthetical reference is there of mine. I added that. Because what we see here in verse 6 is what happens next in this verse occurs years later. It says in verse 6, and in the reign of, and that's a difficult name to pronounce, it looks like a dinosaur, doesn't it? Asherus? I don't know. But I'll tell you, there's another name that's a lot easier to say than that. And that name is Xerxes. Does Xerxes sound familiar to anyone? King Xerxes? Does it sound like it takes place? Oh, I see Tyler with his hand up. See, King Xerxes, yeah, it sounds familiar to another Bible story that many of us know, doesn't it? That's Esther's husband. That's King Xerxes. That gives you a time for when this is all taking place. And obviously the goal of sharing this is to paint the big picture of what God is doing for His people here and in Persia and all over. Because God is working all these places all at the same time. So even under King Xerxes' reign, years down the road, we see that people were writing accusations against God's people to make them look bad. To make them look bad before the king. That's what we see here in the reign of Xerxes. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Basically to say, look, king, these people are bad people, what they're doing is wrong, if they get strong and they build up, then they won't worship you, they won't pay their taxes and so forth and so on. It's just bad news, you need to stop them. And then not only does it occur in King Xerxes' time, it occurs in the next king's time as well. Years even after that, after Xerxes' reign, in verse 7, in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, and Mithridath, and Tabeel, and the rest of the associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated, and we skip on down to the pertinent section of that letter. There's more details that you can read on your own. But the point of their letter, writing it to Artaxerxes, was this, in verse 12. Be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. Terrible people. Just awful people. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. How dare they? Now, be it known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired. I.e., king, if they get strong and build up, you're not going to make any more money off them. So the king says, ooh, wait a second. That's not good. We need to do something about that. Now, again, reinforcing Ezra's point of the persecution that God's people were facing, we jump to verse 24. Which takes place, here's the mind blower, after verse 5. So think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, verse 24. There's your chronology. 7 through 23 are that little illustration reference that Ezra throws in to say, hey, this is how bad things are for God's people right now. There's obstacles that Satan is throwing up there in order to stop the work and the progress. Here's what they are, and this is how bad it is. Verse 24, what happens as a result? of them coming in and trying to infiltrate, trying to intimidate, discourage, and scare, verse 24, then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped. And it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. We know Darius from who? Daniel. Daniel. Fast. It's amazing, isn't it? Absolutely amazing. It all ties together. What we see here is that God's people experience all kinds of obstacles. And yet God is in control of it all. None of this slips his sight. At no point does God go, oh, wow, boy, I didn't see that coming. Man, God is in control of it all. And he works through those obstacles in order to grow his people and to ultimately bring them to the place that he wants them. In the Hindu faith, they actually have a god in their pantheon of gods. All their gods are responsible for different things. Isn't it great to have a God who's responsible for everything? It's kind of nice. In the Hindu faith, Hindu belief system, they have a God who is specifically responsible for obstacles. And his name is Ganesh. He's represented by the multiple arms and the elephant's head. So if you ever see that one, you know that's Ganesh. All right, he's the remover of obstacles. Now, he actually does more than that. He actually puts obstacles in place to check people, too. That's what he does. So if he feels the need, and he sees you're moving along, he says, I need to check that person, bam, there's an obstacle. But he also is the remover of obstacles. And why? Just because he sees fit. It's not for anyone's benefit. It's not because there's a relationship between he and the follower. It's just that's what he does. He puts obstacles in place and he removes them. We have a God who works through the obstacles in our lives to ultimately grow us for our benefit and to fulfill his will for his people where he is. Isn't that fantastic? To know that we have a God who is so powerful that he makes all of these things work according to his will. And that even though sometimes we face obstacles, we face the temptation to compromise in our relationships, we face discouragement and fear sometimes, and we ultimately face people saying bad things about us in our faith, that no matter what, God works through it. No matter what, God takes care of us. And he brings us through that in order to bring us to where he wants us to be. Obstacles are just one of the things that God is in control of in our lives. And even though they're varied, and they vary in intensity and seeming badness, God is still in control of them all. That's not the only thing that he's in control of. He's also in control of the people that come in and out of our lives. He's in control of the people that we encounter. The people that come and go in our lives are not by chance. God is over all of them as well. And we see that first with King Cyrus. We looked at him last week, right? We looked at Cyrus, the one whom God worked in his heart and led him to let God's people go back to their land and rebuild, even to the point where he said, hey, get your people to help out, get some resources, get my people to help out. Here's money, here's stuff you need to rebuild, so forth and so on. Go. He had his reasons for doing it, right? As we saw. But nonetheless, God worked in his heart and led him that way. Was that by an act? Was it coincidence? No. The most amazing part about that whole thing is that we find in Isaiah, in the book of prophecy, that God, some hundreds of years beforehand, had called a man by the name of Cyrus by name to do that very thing. In Isaiah 44:28, God, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose. Saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. We saw that last week, didn't we? But yet God, he had that plan, he had it written down years and years and years and years ahead of time. Because God is in control of all the people in our lives. And none of it is an accident, none of it is a coincidence.